Commander Axe stared at the tactical display with 3 of his 4 eyes while the 4th watched the door. His people had a saying, when death comes knocking, at least have the courtesy to answer properly dressed. They prided themselves on their dignity, even in extinction. The harvester swarms would reach the capital in 72 hours. The evacuation ships could save perhaps 3% of the population. The rest would die when the swarms consumed their world, converting all biological matter into fuel for their endless expansion. It had happened to 47 civilizations in the last century. There would be 48. Axe had sent his family on the first evacuation ship. He would stay and coordinate the defense until the end, buying time for others to escape. It was the dignified thing to do, the proper thing, the way. He reached for the console and activated the Cosmic Tragedy Network. Every species knew about CTN. It broadcast the final hours of dying civilizations, carefully curated and archived, so that others might learn how to face extinction with grace. Some species sang their death songs. Others recorded their histories one last time. They had spent their final day in silent meditation, accepting their fate with philosophical peace. Axe thought he might find comfort in watching others face what he now faced. Instead, the algorithm served him something different. The file was old, tagged with dozens of warnings about cultural contamination and inappropriate response patterns. The species designation read, human, planet, Earth, status, extinct. No, that wasn't right. Axe checked again. Status, active. But if they were active, why were there broadcasts in the tragedy network? He selected the first file. The video showed a narrow mountain pass on a primitive world. The image quality suggested ancient recording technology, reconstructed from historical records. A title appeared in Galactic Standard, Thermopylae, Earth year -480 old calendar. Axe watched as a force of 300 soldiers in bronze armor positioned themselves in the pass. The narrator, speaking in calm Galactic Standard, explained that these humans faced an army of hundreds of thousands. They could not win. They could not escape. They would die here. Axe leaned forward, expecting to see how these humans accepted their fate. Instead, he watched them kill. And kill. And kill. For 3 days, the 300 humans held the pass, their bodies breaking, their armor shattering, but their formation never yielding. When they finally fell, they had taken thousands of enemies with them. The narrator concluded, this noble species made their final stand with courage, though their extinction was inevitable. Axe felt something strange in his chest. Confusion, perhaps, or anger. Those humans hadn't acted like they were extinct. They had acted like they were winning. He selected another file. The Alamo, Earth year 1836. A small fortress. Fewer than 200 humans. Thousands of enemies. The humans could have surrendered. Instead, they fought for 13 days. The narrator called it a tragedy. Another file. Drift, Earth year 1879. 150 humans versus 4,000 warriors. The humans won. They actually won. The narrator still called it a tragedy because the humans faced overwhelming odds and surely expected to perish. Axe played another, and another. Battle after battle, last stand after last stand, except none of them were last stands. The humans kept surviving, and even when they didn't survive, their civilizations continued. These weren't extinction events. These were just things that happened to humans. Commander, his second officer, entered the command center. Sir, you should rest. The final briefing is in 6 hours. Axe gestured at the screen. Watch this. Watched the Battle of Britain. Outnumbered pilots in primitive aircraft, defending their island against an invasion force that should have crushed them. The humans refused to surrender. They flew until their planes fell apart, then got in new planes and flew again. They won, said quietly. Against those odds, they won. They always won, Axe replied. Or if they didn't win, they survived. Or if they didn't survive, their species continued. Every single one of these broadcasts is labeled as a tragedy, filed under extinct species making their final stand. But the humans aren't extinct. They're still alive. Skin shifted through confused colors. I don't understand. Why would the network classify them as tragedies? Because no other species fights like this. Axe pulled up more files, dozens of them, hundreds. Every other civilization in the network faces extinction and accepts it with dignity. The humans faced extinction every other century and spat in its face. They watched in silence as human after human, battle after battle, refused to die quietly. At Stalingrad, an entire city became a fortress. At Wake Island, a tiny garrison bloodied an invasion force. At the battle of Russian soldiers poisoned with gas still charged from their trenches, coughing blood and pieces of lung, because they refused to let the enemy pass. "This is madness," whispered. "They don't fight like they expect to lose. They fight like they expect to win." "Yes," Axe said. The strange feeling in his chest grew stronger. "Yes, they do." The door opened again. More officers filed in, curious about what their commander was watching. Soon, a dozen crowded around the screen. They watched the defensive castle, where American soldiers and German soldiers fought together against SS troops in the final days of Earth's Second World War. They watched the Battle of, where 21 Sikh soldiers held against 10,000 invaders, fighting until every single one had fallen but taking hundreds of enemies with them. "Send this to every ship in the fleet," Axe said suddenly. "Every soldier, every officer, every civilian who hasn't evacuated yet." Sir asked, "Why?" "Because we have been preparing to die with dignity," Axe said. "But these humans have shown us something else, something the galaxy seems to have forgotten. We don't have to accept extinction. We can fight it." The broadcast spread through the fleet like fire through a dried forest. Soldiers who had been preparing for their final stand, expecting to delay the harvesters for a few hours before dying properly, now watched humans refuse to die at all. Pilots who had been planning suicide runs now saw human pilots eject, survive, and return to fight again. Commanders who had been writing elegant final messages now studied human tactics that treated overwhelming odds as merely annoying obstacles. The military council convened in emergency session. Half of them were horrified. "We are not humans," Admiral said firmly. We face death with dignity and grace. We do not thrash about like primitive animals, delaying the inevitable." "What if it isn't inevitable?" Axe asked. The command center fell silent. "What if we've been accepting extinction because we thought we had to, because that's what civilized species do, but the humans were civilized. They had art and music and philosophy. They just also had this." He gestured at the screen, where human Marines held a bridge against an alien invasion in one of their fictional dramas. They refused to cooperate with their own extinction. "The harvesters have never been stopped," another admiral said. 47 civilizations have fallen to them. 47 species accepted their fate with grace. "And died," Axe said flatly. "All 47 died with grace. Perhaps one species should try dying with violence instead, or better yet, not dying at all." The debate raged for 6 hours. The evacuation continued. The harvester swarms drew closer. Finally, Admiral called for a vote. The council split evenly. Axe, as senior tactical commander, held the deciding vote. He thought about his family on the evacuation ship. He thought about the billions of who would die if this failed. He thought about the 300 Spartans who held a pass they couldn't hold. He thought about the pilots over Britain who flew when flying meant death. He thought about the 21 Sikhs who faced 10,000 enemies and never considered surrender. "We fight," Axe said. "Not a delaying action, not a final stand. We fight to win." The order went out across the fleet. All ships, all soldiers, all platforms. They would not conduct a fighting retreat. They would not buy time for evacuation. They would counterattack. The tactical staff thought he had gone mad. A counterattack against the harvesters was suicide. But Axe had watched the humans and he had learned. Suicide was only suicide if you died. If you lived, it was called tactics. 72 hours later, the Harvester swarms entered space, expecting the usual pattern. Orbital defense until it became untenable, retreat to the surface, final resistance, consumption. Instead, the entire fleet jumped in behind them. The Harvesters had never been attacked from behind. No species had ever been that insane. The ships tore into their rear formations with weapons blazing, ramming when weapons failed, pilots ejecting and detonating their reactors when ramming failed. It wasn't dignified. It wasn't graceful. It was human. And for the first time in recorded history, the Harvesters retreated. Commander Axe watched them go and thought about 300 Spartans in a mountain pass, 3,000 years ago on a planet he had never seen. They had held for 3 days and died, but their civilization had survived. Their example had echoed across centuries. Perhaps the example would echo too. Across the galaxy, other dying species watched the cosmic tragedy network and saw something new. Not a graceful extinction, not a philosophical acceptance of death. They saw the fight like humans, and they saw the Harvesters bleed. The broadcast spread, and the galaxy began to wonder, what exactly were these humans, and why did the tragedy network have so many files on a species that refused to be tragic? The search for answers began. The galaxy learned quickly that finding information about humans was easy. Finding accurate information was harder. They weren't the only ones watching human broadcasts now. Dozens of species, facing their own extinction events, had discovered humanity's tragic last stands and found hope in them. But questions arose. If all these battles were humanity's extinction events, how were humans still alive? If these were their final moments, why did their civilization continue? The files were labeled as tragedies, filed under species facing inevitable doom, but the humans kept not being doomed. The Galactic Historical Institute dispatched a research vessel to Earth's coordinates. The journey took 3 months. During that time, they fought 2 more engagements against the Harvesters, winning both by using what they now called human doctrine, which mainly consisted of refusing to accept that they were supposed to lose. Other species took notice. The Kelvin Confederacy, facing a stellar plague that had consumed their outer colonies, stopped trying to contain it peacefully and started burning infected sectors with thermonuclear fire. The plague stopped spreading. The Communion, besieged by war machines left over from an ancient conflict, stopped trying to negotiate and started melting the machines down with plasma weapons. The machines were destroyed. The Cosmic Tragedy Network's moderators sent increasingly panicked messages to the Central Archive. Species weren't accepting their extinctions anymore. They were fighting back, and they were winning. The common thread in every case was exposure to human broadcasts. When the research vessel reached Earth, the crew expected to find ruins. Perhaps a recovering civilization, struggling to rebuild after the catastrophic events shown in their broadcasts. Instead, they found a thriving world with orbital cities, lunar colonies, and exploration vessels heading out to their neighboring planets. The research team contacted the nearest human authority, which turned out to be something called the United Nations Broadcast Commission. They asked for a meeting to discuss humanity's placement in the Tragedy Network archives. Professor Sarah met them at the UN headquarters in New Geneva. She was a historian specializing in military conflicts. The research team explained their confusion as politely as possible, showing her the broadcasts that had been filed under humanity's extinction events. Sarah watched Thermopylae, she watched the Alamo, she watched Drift in Stalingrad and Wake Island. When the last one finished, she started laughing. She laughed so hard she had to sit down. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping her eyes. "I'm sorry, but you have to understand. These aren't our extinction events. These are just battles. We have thousands of them, tens of thousands. These particular ones are famous because they show good tactics or interesting outcomes, but they're not special. They're just history." The lead researcher, a named X, stared at her. But your species faced overwhelming odds. You were outnumbered, facing certain death. The broadcasts clearly show. Yeah, we were losing those battles, Sarah interrupted. But we weren't going extinct. We lost battles all the time. Sometimes we won them. Sometimes we lost and came back later. That's just how war works. You fight, you adapt, you keep going. But the odds, X insisted. 300 against hundreds of thousands, 150 against 4,000. These numbers represent impossible situations. Sarah shrugged. Difficult situations, not impossible. Impossible means it can't be done. These were all done. The Spartans held for 3 days, which was the whole point. The defenders of Drift held all night and won. Difficult just means you have to be smart and stubborn. Another researcher, a named who had joined the expedition specifically to meet humans, spoke up. Your broadcast saved my species. We watched your last stands and learned that extinction could be fought, that we didn't have to accept death with dignity. We could resist. Last stands, Sarah looked confused. I mean, some of these were last stands for those specific units, but humanity didn't. We never had a last stand. We've never faced extinction. We've faced wars, plagues, disasters, but we always survived. We're too stubborn to go extinct. The research team exchanged looks. Professor, X said carefully, the Cosmic Tragedy Network has over 3,000 human broadcasts filed under extinction-level events. Are you telling us that none of these were actual existential threats to your species? Sarah pulled up the list on her tablet and scrolled through it. Okay, this one is from a movie, this one is from a video game, this one is. Yeah, that's the Black Death, that was bad, but we survived it. This one is from a TV show. This is a sporting event. Why is a football match in here? This is a historical reenactment. This is. She kept scrolling. Who compiled this list? Half of this is fiction and the other half is just normal history. Normal history, repeated faintly. You consider these events normal. Well, not pleasant, Sarah said. But yeah, this is just stuff that happened. Every species has disasters and wars and close calls. That's just life. You learn from them and keep going. X felt his world tilting. Professor, do you understand what your broadcasts have done? Dozens of species have watched humans face extinction and refuse to accept it. They have learned from your example. They are fighting back against threats they would have previously accepted as inevitable. The entire galactic understanding of extinction events is being rewritten because of you. Sarah's smile faded. Wait, are you saying other species just accept extinction? They just give up and die? Yes, said. It's considered the civilized response. When a threat becomes overwhelming, when survival becomes impossible, a species should accept their fate with dignity. That's what the Tragedy Network is for, to document how species face their final moments with grace. That's the thing I've ever heard, Sarah said flatly. Why would you just accept dying? You fight, you adapt, you find a way. That's what intelligence is for. But if the odds are impossible, then you change the odds, Sarah interrupted. You find an advantage. You use strategy. You refuse to cooperate with your own extinction. How is this not obvious? The research team sat in stunned silence. Finally, X spoke. We need to contact the Galactic Council. This changes everything. The report reached the Galactic Council within a week. The Council, a body representing 300 civilizations, convened in emergency session. The news was presented simply. Humanity had never faced extinction. Every broadcast that had inspired dozens of species to resist their own deaths was simply humanity being humanity. Their tactical doctrine, their refusal to accept defeat, their aggressive survival instinct, this was normal for them. The council split immediately. Half argued that humanity was dangerous, a species whose very existence undermined galactic order. If species stopped accepting natural extinction, it would lead to chaos. The other half argued that humanity was the most valuable discovery in 1,000 years. If their approach to survival could be taught, extinction rates might plummet. They decided to send a delegation to Earth with a formal request. Humanity needed to stop being accidentally inspirational. The Tragedy Network would remove all human broadcasts and reclassify them appropriately. Humanity would be asked to keep their survival strategies to themselves for the good of galactic stability. The delegation arrived 6 months later. They presented their case to the UN Security Council with careful diplomacy and extensive documentation of the chaos humanity's broadcasts had caused. They showed footage of the counterattack against the Harvesters. They showed the Kelvin Confederacy burning plague worlds. They showed a dozen species abandoning dignified extinction in favor of violent resistance. "We understand this was unintentional," the delegation leader said. "You did not mean to disrupt galactic civilization, but you must understand the situation you have created. Species are fighting when they should be accepting. They are suffering when they could be dying peacefully. Your approach to survival is not universal. We ask that you keep it private." The Security Council listened. Then the Secretary General, a woman named, asked a simple question. "How many of those species that watched our broadcasts are still alive?" The delegation shifted uncomfortably. "That's not the point." "How many?" repeated. 17 species that would have gone extinct are currently surviving, the delegation leader admitted. "But they're suffering. They're in pain. They're fighting instead of accepting peace." "They're alive," said. "You came here to ask us to stop showing people how to survive because survival is uncomfortable. Do I have that right?" "You're oversimplifying." "Am I?" gestured to the other council members. "Let me be clear. Humanity isn't going to apologize for refusing to die. We're not going to hide how we survive. And we're absolutely not going to tell other species that they should just accept extinction because it's more civilized than fighting." The delegation tried again. They explained the natural order, the cycle of civilizations, the peace that came with accepting one's fate. The Security Council remained unmoved. Finally, one of the human representatives, a military advisor named General, made a suggestion. "You want to know why we survive? Come watch." The delegation was taken to a military training facility where they observed human combat exercises. They watched Marines train for hostile environment warfare. They watched pilots practice impossible maneuvers. They watched tacticians run scenarios where the enemy had every advantage, and the humans still found ways to win. "This is what you've been watching in the Tragedy Network," General explained. "This is us holding back. This is us training. This is us at peace. You want to see humanity at war. We've been at peace with ourselves for 200 years. We don't have war footage anymore. All we have is history and training." The delegation watched a simulated battle where human forces were outnumbered 10-1. The humans won by splitting their forces, attacking from unexpected angles, using terrain creatively, and refusing to follow expected tactical patterns. The simulation commander explained that this was considered a basic training scenario. One of the delegates, a named Al, asked quietly, "What would you do if you actually faced extinction? If the threat was real and overwhelming?" General looked at her seriously. "We'd fight. We'd adapt. We'd find every possible advantage and create the ones we couldn't find. We'd make the enemy pay for every meter of ground. We'd turn our cities into fortresses, our civilians into soldiers, our very planet into a weapon if we had to. And if we lost, if we actually died, we'd make sure the enemy remembered us. We'd make sure the cost of defeating us was so high that they'd think twice before attacking anyone else." "That's insane," Al whispered. "That's humanity," General replied. "We don't believe in impossible. We believe in difficult, and difficult just means you have to try harder." The delegation returned to the Galactic Council with their report. The request to silence humanity was formally withdrawn. Instead, a new proposal emerged. Humanity should be invited to share their tactical knowledge with species facing extinction events. Humanity should be asked to help. The Security Council debated for 3 days. Some argued for isolation. The galaxy's problems weren't humanity's responsibility. Others argued for limited intervention, advice and training, but no direct combat. A few argued for full commitment. If humanity's accidental history lessons were saving civilizations, imagine what humanity actively trying could accomplish. The deciding vote came from an unexpected source. They sent a direct message to Earth, broadcast publicly so the whole galaxy could see it. Commander Axe, now Admiral Axe, spoke simply, "You taught us that extinction is not inevitable. You taught us that hopelessness is a choice. Now teach us how you survived everything. Don't tell us your tactics. Show us. Stand with us. Let us learn from humans who are actually trying to save us, not just humans who happen to record their own history." The message hit every news network on Earth. Polls showed overwhelming support for intervention. The Security Council voted and the resolution passed. Humanity would answer the call. The first human advisory fleet deployed 3 months later. 50 ships, mostly training vessels and support craft, carrying a few hundred military advisors. They welcomed them like heroes. Other species watched to see what would happen. The harvesters returned to space within a week, as if sensing weakness. They encountered a combined human defense fleet. The battle lasted 6 hours. The harvesters lost 30% of their swarm and retreated. They didn't return. News spread fast. Human advisors were requested by the Kelvin Confederacy, the Communion, the Republic, and a dozen other species facing various existential threats. Humanity deployed advisory forces to each one. The results were dramatic. The Kelvin plague was contained by using aggressive quarantine tactics that the Kelvin had considered too harsh. Human advisors pointed out that harsh, but effective, was better than gentle and extinct. The war machines were defeated using coordinated strikes that violated every cultural norm about honorable combat. Human advisors pointed out that machines don't care about honor. Within 2 years, extinction-level events across the galaxy dropped by 40%, not because the threats disappeared, but because species stopped accepting them. They learned human tactics. More importantly, they learned human mindset. You don't have to cooperate with your own extinction. The Galactic Council officially reclassified humanity. They could no longer be considered a developing civilization. They weren't a threat, but they weren't peaceful either. A new category was created specifically for them: extinction-resistant aggressor species, with a subcategory added after much debate: inspirational. The Cosmic Tragedy Network underwent a forced reorganization. Human broadcasts could no longer be filed under tragedies because humans kept surviving them. A new archive was created, the Hope Archive. Species facing extinction were now directed there instead of to the Tragedy Network. The disclaimer was simple: the following species refuse to die. Viewer discretion advised. Side effects may include hope, resistance, and survival. 5 years after humanity joined the galactic community, Admiral Axe stood in a memorial garden on Prime. The garden honored the thousands who had died in the desperate counterattack that saved their species. Beside him stood Lieutenant Commander Maria, one of the first human advisors deployed to space. "We built this to remember those who fell when we fought back," Axe said quietly. "Before you came, we would have built it to remember everyone, the entire species. Now it's just a war memorial." Maria nodded. "War memorials are better than extinction memorials." "Your people have so many of them," Axe observed. "So many wars, so many battles. Do you ever regret fighting so much?" Maria considered the question. "We regret the fighting, we regret the dying, but we don't regret surviving. Every memorial on Earth is a reminder that we faced something terrible and kept going. That's worth remembering." "The galaxy is changing because of you," Axe said. "Species that would have died peacefully are now fighting violently. Some of them still lose, but more of them survive. Is that better?" "I think living is better than dying peacefully," Maria said. "But I'm human. We're biased towards survival." Axe's skin shifted through thoughtful colors. The council asked me to thank humanity officially for the military assistance, for the tactical doctrine, for the inspiration. I told them I would, but I wanted to ask you something first. Why did you help us? You didn't have to. The galaxy's problems weren't your responsibility. Maria smiled. You watched our history and learned that extinction isn't inevitable. We watched you fight back and learned that we're not alone in the universe, that there are other species who can learn to be as stubborn as we are. That's worth fighting for. We learned from your past, Axe said. You helped us because of your present. What about your future? What will humanity do now that you're part of the galactic community? Same thing we've always done, Maria replied. Survive, explore, help others survive. Maybe fight some wars if we have to. Build memorials to remember the cost. And absolutely, definitely refuse to accept that anything is impossible. Admiral Axe looked at the memorial garden, where flowers grew in soil that had almost been consumed by harvester swarms. There's a human phrase I learned from your broadcasts, 3 words that seem to sum up your entire species' philosophy. What phrase? Fuck yeah, Axe said carefully, testing the pronunciation. Maria laughed. Yeah, that's pretty much it. The galaxy continued to change. Extinction rates continued to drop. The Tragedy Network became less popular while the Hope Archive grew. Species learned that difficult wasn't the same as impossible, that fighting back was an option, that survival was a choice you made every day. And somewhere in Earth's archives, the original Thermopylae broadcast remained filed under Basic Military History, Ancient Period, example of effective delaying tactics. No one had ever thought to label it a tragedy. It was just 300 people doing their job, knowing that their sacrifice would buy time for others to prepare, knowing that their civilization would continue. The Spartans had never expected to survive, but they had expected their people to survive. That was the difference. That was the lesson the galaxy learned from humanity. You don't fight to avoid dying. You fight so that someone else can keep living. And if everyone fights like that, maybe everyone lives. The broadcasts continued. New ones were added regularly. Not tragedies, but examples, lessons, inspiration. And across the galaxy, species facing their darkest moments tuned in and learned the most human lesson of all. Extinction is only inevitable if you accept it. Humanity had never accepted it. The galaxy was learning not to accept it either. And that made all the difference.